Production of Lake Defenders is made possible in part by Aquatic Invasive Management LLC, taking on invasive species hand to hand, lake after lake. More information available at milfoilremoval.com. And by
Summertime at the lake. Memories of childhood, rituals of family and friends, and contemplative moments of the divine. And Lake George, the queen of America's lakes, has long been a bridge to America's wilderness and a generous provider of recreation and inspiration. At the core of America's character is growth and progress. And bearing the load of our relentless pursuits are the natural systems we rely upon. The story of humanity's impact on our Earth's resources is broad and complex. This is a small chapter about a dedicated group struggling to preserve aquatic systems and their call for us to join them.
The average citizen that comes here is probably unaware of invasive species. When you look at Lake George and you swim in Lake George and we drink the water, we think everything's okay because the cover looks all right, but beneath the water it isn't.
If I have the ability to affect long-term protection for Lake George, then 30 years from now when my kids are in this role of hoping to protect Lake George and working around the lake, then they can say, you know what, they did the right thing.
There's a really motivated community here of NGOs, of watershed organizations, of state agency workers, of federal workers, who all are willing to respond to incidences where we have a new invasion of an invasive in the lake.
Darren Freshwater Institute, Lake George Association, Fund for Lake George, they all work together. You need the community and you need scientists, ecologists, biologists, like everyone needs to work together to really make this happen.
I've been coming to the lake all my life and lived here year-round since 1976. Lake George is our backyard and we want to protect it for that reason, but we also want to protect it so that we can pass it down to the next generation.
When you hear the word invasive species, it's a word that no one that treasures any lake, anywhere in the country, wants to hear. And we've been dealing with those in Lake George for several years.
Invasive species in general would be ones that are non-native. So any species that are being brought in some instances from Asia, in some instances from Russia, from other locations, once they're brought in to an area, because they're non-native, they have a couple of competitive advantages.
They don't have those other species from their native habitat that compete with them for those different habitats. So they're not pushed into one area, or they may not have a certain type of predator in our ecosystem that they had in their habitat of origin.
It's an interesting philosophical question more than a biological question when you ask what is an invasive species. I could play devil's advocate for fun, which I love to do as a scientist, and say, well, all right, if you take the strictest definition of invasive species, it means a species that originated somewhere else and moved into this place. If you take that strict definition, then I'm an invasive species. But I don't like to think of myself as that. Technically, I think what people really mean when they use that term, invasive species, what they're saying is it's a species that wasn't here before in living memory, and it's one that we wish wasn't here.
We are focused on those species that are not native to the system, but also cause measurable harm to the environment, to society, the economy, and human health. Invasive species rank as one of the leading environmental threats to the loss of biodiversity, and it really is the number of invasives that are getting moved around and the rate at which they're getting moved around. And the frequency surpasses the system's ability to respond. When we have numerous species coming into a system and we have local species lost, those species aren't able to recover, and we see invasives taking over and forming dense monocultures and sometimes causing irreversible damage.
The ecological impact of invasives, although profound, is not always noticed by the casual observer. But in an area that relies primarily on tourism, the economic impact can be devastating.
Here in Lake George, they impact tourism by impacting fishing, by creating a non-pleasant environment for going to the beaches and walking in the sand and cutting up your feet. Where you have a large bed of Asian clams, you often also see a large algal bloom on top of it. And so if we have areas where we've got this pond scum over them, that's not really where people want to be. And a number of people in Lake George still do take their drinking water from the lake. They can, both the zebra mussels and the Asian clams, end up clogging pipes. And so that's another concern.
One of the first significant outbreaks of invasive species was in the mid-1980s with Eurasian watermilfoil. Dense mats were found in approximately 180 reported colonies.
Eurasian watermilfoil is one of 8 aquatic invasive plants in the region, and it is by far the most widespread. We have 79 waterways that are infected, and over 50 of those include Eurasian watermilfoil. And it's one of the more common invasive aquatic plants across the country, really.
It lives out of the water for a good period of time. It can be transported in your boat bilge, on your trailer, in your prop.
It's very easily spread by fragmentation. That's part of the reason why we're seeing it so widespread in the region. And many lakes are struggling to manage the species. It's very difficult to manage. It grows at waters up to 30 feet deep. And it's a perennial plant, so that means you might do management one year, but then you have to come back year after year after year and really deplete the roots and seed bank to have success in the long run. And it's very costly to do management of milfoil.
If you have small populations, you can hand harvest them. For small areas, probably the preferred way, the hand harvesting. A second way is by, I'll call it suction harvesting. Essentially, you have a large hose hooked up, you almost use it like a vacuum cleaner, and you suction them up into a cage and then take them away. And that would be probably for mid-sized areas. And then the third method would be to essentially use benthic barrier mats, dark-colored plastic sheets that do not allow light to go through, and therefore the plants don't photosynthesize. Essentially, you've cut off their light, and then they die under those mats. The goal is prevention. If you can prevent the introduction, that's going to be the least costly. Prevention also focuses on education, so you don't have an introduction. If you can't prevent the introduction, or you've missed that stage, then the next stage would be early detection, where you can potentially try to come up with an eradication strategy opposed to a management strategy. And the third would be what happened with the Eurasian watermilfoil, which is it was caught too late and it could not be eradicated. The choice for dealing with Eurasian watermilfoil was management, year after year after year. The second major introduction was zebra mussels.
Zebra mussels are transported. They actually have little hairs that can grab onto your trailer, onto your prop, so they actually adhere to that. And when they go in the lake and they fall off and then they reproduce.
Zebra mussels, Eurasian watermilfoil, and many other invasive species can be transported via watercraft. Adding to the challenge of monitoring boat traffic is the actual interconnection of waterways throughout the region. The north end of Lake George connects directly to Lake Champlain, where there are currently 49 known invasive species.
The number of known non-native and invasive species in the Great Lakes is over 180. We are separated from them through the Erie Canal, and the St. Lawrence Seaway also has close to 90 non-native and invasive species. We're connected to them through the north through the Chambly Canal and the Richelieu River. And the south and the Hudson, we're connected to them through the Champlain Canal. These are unnatural hydrologic connections, but they're open pathways.
Once zebra mussels were found in the Hudson River and in Lake Champlain, we started a monitoring program for potential early introduction of zebra mussels here in Lake George in 1995. And the first colony of zebra mussels were found here down at the Lake George Village in 1999. And it was an early find with a possibility of eradicating. In the end, about 22,000 individual zebra mussels were removed. They have been found in a few other locations, but we're treating those in a similar fashion. By removing that huge population initially and going back subsequently, we have had no successful reproduction and recruitment of the zebra mussels there.
The Asian clam, we're not really sure how it got here. We're finding it in areas where there are boat launches, in areas where there are sandy soils, often brought in, and man-made beaches. The theory is they've come in through bait buckets, they've come in through aquariums where somebody doesn't want to necessarily kill their fish, but they no longer want the fish in their home, so they would dump in an aquarium. Asian clams are sold on the market to help filter and keep your aquarium clean. They could be in bilge water. You could have small juveniles in your bilge, and if you don't empty it after you leave a place and dry your boat thoroughly, it could be coming in there. They don't have any hairs, they don't stick to propellers, they don't adhere, so the only way they could be here is dumped in the lake in some form. With the Asian clam, its infestation in Lake George has been more significant than the zebra mussels, so we are still hoping to somehow contain the Asian clams, trying to eradicate them, but we recognize we may be in a management strategy for that.
Particularly with the Asian clam epidemic, I'd call it, we've learned much from Tahoe's experience. At the beginning, they didn't take it seriously, and now there are entire bays that are closed to boat traffic. And they're spending somewhere between $2 and $3 million a year just to control that one invasive species.
The common thought is, what is the problem with Asian clams? You just have more clams in the water, and that's absolutely not the case. Asian clam is a mollusk that reproduces prolifically. For example, in 1 square yard of area, you can have up to 10,000 clams. And when they die, and they die on a 3-year cycle, they rise to the surface, and as they decompose, they foul the water. And all of those shells, those thousands of shells, sit on the sand, and they can be up to 2, 3, 4 inches thick of decomposed shells and sand. And if that takes over the entire lakeshore, that's not simply an environmental issue, that's an economic issue, that's a business issue, that's a what do we do about it now because we can't access Lake George anymore issue. That's the concern, and that's why we need to do this.
Forward.
The Environmental Research Center team in Lake Tahoe has been successful in increasing Asian clam mortality through the installation of benthic barrier mats. These 50-foot-long PVC mats are rolled out over the lake bottom, covering dense populations of Asian clams. Once installed and weighed down with number 5 rebar, the dissolved oxygen level underneath the mats is effectively reduced to a point where the clams suffocate and can no longer survive. In Lake George, this approach to eradication has been equally effective.
In the village of Lake George, we've gotten a very good success rate of killing the clams under those mats.
They're laid down literally one at a time, starting with sealing the outside edges, then overlapping with the next mat you're putting down, and then sealing those and going in a sequential fashion. In terms of about 5 acres, it was over 800 and some mats that needed to be laid.
In order to pinpoint the exact location for each benthic barrier, sites must first be carefully surveyed before the deployment stage can begin.
What we really want to do is survey and find out if there's any more locations of Asian clam out there. So what we've been working to do is identify priority sites around the lake. So sites that are shallow and sandy, sites that are used by boats, so boat launches, marinas, things like that. And then what they're doing to survey the site is they're actually swimming parallel to shore at around 2 feet and 6 feet in depth. They have brass sieves with them and they're sieving as they go. So it's not just a visual survey, they're actually sieving sediment on regular intervals and they look for clams. And then after that, they're doing transects out perpendicular to the shoreline every 50 feet and sieving there as well. So it's a very in-depth survey for each individual site that we're working on. We get a lot of data, a lot of sieves, hopefully pretty good confidence whether or not there are or aren't clams at each site.
The most effective, least expensive way to deal with invasive species is to keep them out of your lake to begin with. Lake George Association is the oldest lake association in the country and a pioneer in the conservation movement. With our Lake Steward program, for instance. The lake stewards actually meet with boaters at boat launches around the lake as they're launching or retrieving their boat. They interact with the boaters, they take some information from them. Where have you been lately? What was the last body of water your boat was in? Have you taken any measures to prevent the spread of invasive species on your boat, your trailer? They inspect the boats, they help the boat owners remove invasive species if they see them. So we have many saves every single year.
You know, 90% of the people are very compliant and they really want to, you know, understand and hear your information, and they want you to check their boat.
Wheel wells are a good spot too where they can get caught.
It really reaches people on a different level, and you know, people have sentimental value of the lake. They've been coming up here for a really long time, and this might not be here if we don't prevent this.
And that's part of the public education and the outreach that we're looking for too. What we're finding year after year after year is more and more people have had interactions with the lake stewards, have had interactions with education and outreach programs, so they're learning more about the lake, they're learning more about how to protect it and how not to spread invasive species.
We're gonna get some water samples. So this traps the water so that it can't mix with any other water as we pull it up, okay?
The floating classroom started in the early 1990s and has been our main educational program, educating school children and then now educating, you know, really everyone around the lake about Lake George. It's very important to educate kids. They're going to be the next lake stewards here, so we really want to help educate them so that they have that connection to Lake George, that love of Lake George as they grow up, so that they'll want to come back here and protect it.
Need help get them in focus, let me know, and then try to match them up to the pictures.
We talk about the Lake George watershed and how that impacts the lake and its water quality. And you get to do a lot of great hands-on experiments on the boat. We measure water quality using something called the Secchi disc. We actually catch plankton and we pull them up with a special plankton net and look at them under microscopes. So it's really an adventure.
Whether it's a level of K through 12 in education or whether it's a level of the highest politicians and legislators, the science is absolutely critical to the treatment or the management. It underlies anything that's being done. The Daring Freshwater Institute mission, it's threefold. 1 is research, 2 is education, and 3 is outreach, all with a focus on the environment. The questions people ask are, okay, how old are the clams? How long do you think the clams have been here? How do you think the clams have been introduced? And how effective do you think you can be at killing the clams? And all of those questions require some science to back them.
Originally, when we found Asian clam last August, we contacted some folks out at Lake Tahoe, and actually through the Darren Freshwater Institute, they were actually able to bring some of the researchers from Lake Tahoe out here to meet with us and speak to us. So we really learned a lot from their battle with Asian clam. And so ever since then, we've kept in contact with them, a lot of communication about what they're doing, what we're doing, and what's working. So we're both really learning from each other.
They instituted a mandatory inspection and boat washing / decontamination program. So anytime you want to launch a boat now into Lake Tahoe, you have to go through an inspection station, and they certify that your boat is clean. And if it is, off you go and you launch into the lake. That's what Lake Tahoe is doing. We've done extensive research, and it appears that mandatory decontamination will be probably the long-term protection of Lake George.
Certainly the last thing that we want to do is pass regulation upon regulation upon regulation and make it uncomfortable for both the resident and the tourist to come here. I think a mixture of both regulatory means and voluntary awareness will work.
And that's where the Lake George Park Commission comes in, because we have not only the obligation to do this, but we also have the authority. The Park Commission is a state agency that is solely responsible for the long-term protection of Lake George.
The boats coming to Lake George need to be inspected. And if they're contaminated, they need to be cleaned. And anything short of that, I think, is a disservice to Lake George.
We're not in the business of going out and developing regulations because this is what we have to do. There's no reason behind it. If we don't do this, one boat with invasive species can literally destroy the shoreline of Lake George forever. And we know that because this has happened to 25 lakes here in New York. It's happened to some of the most important lakes across the country and worldwide. And here we still have a chance to stop it. Let's address it now while we still can.
The latest invasive to be found in Lake George is the spiny water flea. This tiny crustacean competes with native fish for food, and its sharp spine protects it from predators, allowing for rapid population growth and continued expansion throughout our connected waterways.
We don't want to be the vector for the rest of the park for these invasives, and that's one of the reasons why we're really trying to manage our invasive species and also make sure that stewardship and education keeps it from spreading to other water bodies.
An important role that we serve, being an international and interstate organization at the Lake Champlain Basin Program, is that we are connected nationally to folks who have expertise in species that might end up here. We may not be expecting them, but we can call on California or Florida or Ohio, and they may have a lot of expertise, and it's easy to connect with them and get that expertise into our region to help answer our questions and say, what do we do here? We didn't know the Asian clam was coming. What can we do?
It's a continuous, ongoing problem. We attack milfoil, we spend money on it, we come up with a successful program, and then along comes the Asian clam. So we're attacking that now.
All New Yorkers should care about invasive species because whether we know it or not, our whole existence is linked to our natural resources. No matter where we go in the globe, we are going to be faced with invasive species issues. And one of the main issues is the rate at which invasive species are moving around the landscape and also the numbers of species that are moving. Ecosystems cannot respond as quickly as needed to absorb these changes. In the beginning, you may not notice a difference between this green plant and that green plant, but over time, we are seeing losses in biodiversity, losses in ecosystem function, and the services that those systems provide to us.
The person that comes here needs to be educated. The local folks need to be educated, and sometimes you don't realize how lucky you are to have something until it starts to deteriorate and you miss it. We don't want that to happen in Lake George.
We have great research institutions here on the lake. We have nonprofits that are working together. We have a government regulatory agency, Lake George Park Commission. This is an effort that could not be done by any single organization. State government, local governments, we all need to work together to do this.
Each group has a slightly different perspective coming into it. The bottom line is, it's the love of Lake George.
Lake Defenders is available on DVD for $14.95 plus shipping and handling. To order your copy, call 1-800-836-5700 or order online at mountainlake.org. Production of Lake Defenders is made possible in part by Aquatic Invasive Management LLC, taking on invasive species hand-to-hand, lake after lake. More information available at milfoilremoval.com. And by